Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stluke'sonline.org.
In collaboration with Boise State Public Radio, the Community Library presents a new podcast, Sheep Stories. I'm host Vance Cunningham. Join me as we listen through the archives of the Trailing of the Sheep Festival to learn about the Scottish, Basque, and Peruvian immigrants foundational to the sheep herding industry over the past century. Hear their stories of traveling to Idaho and learning the language of the sheep. Find Sheep Stories wherever you get your podcasts and at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. We're failing our kids. That's a quote from a Fruitland mom who says her daughter and other kids who need special education are falling through the cracks here in Idaho. A new investigation has learned that more and more parents are filing lawsuits against the state of Idaho, saying our state is failing to give their children the special education they need, while officials say they don't have the money or the personnel to meet the needs of these children. Reporter Becca Savransky covers education and equity issues for the Idaho Statesman, and she dug into this story for her report in ProPublica, which is titled, Idaho Schools Consistently Break Disability Laws. And Becca is here to talk more about this with us. Becca, nice to have you on the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So you talked to quite a few parents, Becca. What sorts of issues are they having, or they tell you they're having with Idaho's special education system?
Yeah, so I talked to a number of parents, and basically, under federal special education law, school districts are required to provide students with disabilities with a free and appropriate public education. But parents in Idaho say they have long been struggling to get their kids the services they need. And this could be, parents whose kids are struggling to learn to read and write, but they can't get their school to provide an evaluation and to provide the services they feel their children need. Or in some cases, parents whose children are having behavioral challenges, and school districts are resorting to, restraint and seclusion, and they don't have the appropriate behavioral intervention plans in place. And then when students do qualify for special education, they get put on what's called an individualized education program. And that basically outlines, the services and the instruction that they should receive. But parents have been telling us that, some of the most common problems relate to districts either failing to put these together correctly or failing to follow them.
So, Becca, is that really some of the main examples you saw was, so to shorten that, an IEP, not putting that IEP in place, or as you said, not following it? I'm curious if there were any other examples that stood out to you in your investigation.
Yeah. So, one of the main examples we talk about in the story is this, mother who had watched her daughter struggle for years through elementary school with reading. And this mother had actually been diagnosed herself with dyslexia later in life. So she kind of recognized some of the signs and she understood a lot of what her daughter was going through. And her daughter, had been diagnosed by an outside specialist with dyslexia. The mother was seeing this, child fall further and further behind in school, and she was getting more and more anxious at school, just kind of struggling to, read tests and keep up with her peers. And this mother, got her daughter a tutor. She'd spend hours studying spelling with her every night, and tried to do what she could on her own to help. But eventually she ended up filing complaint with the state saying that the district essentially wouldn't evaluate her daughter for special education. She wanted her daughter to be on an IEP to get some of the individualized instruction and services, but the district wouldn't do it. And, in her case, a few months later, a state investor came back and said, yes, this mother's allegations were founded, basically, required the district to start the process of formally evaluating her daughter. And it also found that the district didn't have kind of the right procedures and policies in place to make sure that all students with disabilities were identified and helped.
So, Becca, my understanding is that the recourse parents have is to file a complaint, like you just mentioned that this particular mom did. So, what happens when a complaint is filed?
Yeah, so when a complaint is filed, a state investigator will look into the complaint as long as it's kind of within the specific parameters outlined in that complaint process. So it has to be alleging a violation of the, Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There are other routes that parents can take if they're alleging issues relating to discrimination or harassment or other things like that. But in this process, a state investigator will basically talk to the relevant parties, look through documents, and after their investigation is complete, they will issue a report, and that will either say the allegations weren't founded, or they will report that the complaint was founded and will issue an associated corrective action plan. And so that plan will lay out exactly what the district needs to do to correct the problem. And those corrective action plans can include kind of a number of things. They normally include training for staff members relating to the issue. So that could be, training on putting together IEPs, training on the evaluation process, how to identify students with disabilities. And it could also say, the district needs to put into place certain policies or procedures that they may not have had. And then also often includes something specific to the student. So in the case I just mentioned, it said the district needed to begin the evaluation process for the student. In some cases, it could include that the district needs to provide additional hours of education to make up for some of the education that was missed.
Mhm. So, according to your investigation, about 20% of Idaho districts have broken the law several times in the last 5 years, and almost 40% broke the law at least once. Um, Talk to us about how you found that information because I think it is fairly shocking that it is that large of a number.
Yeah, so this was data that we received from the State Department of Education. We had requested the number of districts who had received one through, 10 corrective action plans over the past 5 years, and calculated those numbers to find that about, yeah, 20% of districts had received at least one. So they had received at least one founded complaint, and nearly 40% had received two or more. Um, and so basically, we've seen, over the past few years, parents have increasingly been resorting to filing these complaints against their districts. In most of the cases, the complaints filed, an investigator will find that the complaint had at least one founded allegation. And we've also seen that, the state is having to put some more money and staff into this issue. Data shows us that, the state has increasingly had to spend more to investigate these complaints. In some cases, if the complaint is really complex or if it's a systemic complaint, so that's a complaint that's affecting,
Hmm.
multiple students in the district, um, they'll have to spend, upwards of tens of thousands of dollars. And this year we saw the legislature approved a staff member to in part help another staff member to help handle some of these complaints to support the dispute resolution coordinator.
So, State Superintendent Debbie Critchfield says part of the problem is the funding system, that it's not based on how many students actually have special needs in each district. So, can we talk about the funding model? How does it work?
Yeah, so we have a decades old, very complex funding model. But the formula basically assumes that a certain percentage of students will be in special education in each district. It's what's called a census-based formula. And so in Idaho, we're assuming that 5.5 to 6% of students will be in special education, and then in kind of a complex way, providing some additional funding based on those numbers. But in reality, about 12% of students in Idaho qualify for special education, and we've seen, those numbers continue to grow over the past several years. And we know, over the past decade or so, there have been several efforts to revise Idaho's funding formula, but none of those efforts have really gone anywhere.
You found a big difference between what the state is spending and what it should be spending. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so a report from the Office of Performance Evaluations last year estimated that the gap between what the state allocates for special education students and what districts are spending is over $80 million. And that report found that most districts in Idaho are spending more than they receive for that. So they're basically having to, make up those costs in other ways because, like we said, under federal law, school districts are required to provide those services. So they could kind of make up the costs in a number of different ways. A lot of school districts run levies. We know that most districts in Idaho rely upon supplemental levies, or they have to kind of find other areas in their, general budget to fund those students. And we've seen, over the past few years, there have been different bills proposed to help try to alleviate some of these challenges that districts face. This past year, there was a bill proposed to help districts to provide some funds for students with higher needs, such as, some students who may need a full-time nurse or a full-time aide. Those can cost districts, a lot of money. But we saw that that bill didn't make it through the legislative process.
Now, Becca, in your reporting, you also found that education officials say it can be really hard to find and retain special education teachers, but in particular in those rural school districts here in Idaho, because they may not be able to pay as much as they could somewhere else. So, in your reporting, how did you find that that actually impacted what's going on?
Yeah, so I've heard from, state and local school officials how difficult it can be to find special education teachers and keep them. We know that working in a school can be a really difficult, high stress job a lot of the time. So there is a lot of turnover in those roles. And so we've seen, when there's a lot of turnover, staff members will have to be retrained. There won't be as much institutional knowledge. There aren't as many teachers who have a lot of that experience. And we've seen there's kind of a number of reasons for this. Maybe in some cases, Idaho can't pay as much as neighboring states. It can be difficult to attract special education teachers to some of those rural areas. We've seen challenges with kind of the pipeline from college to special education teachers. And in some cases, teachers can just feel, kind of a lack of support or a lack of resources.
Mhm. So, Becca, you, as I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, you talked to quite a few parents, and you even talked with parents who have actually pulled their children from districts because they say that these children just are not getting the help that they need, and they've maybe tried to get them into charter schools. I mean, some have even moved out of the state because of this. So, how frustrated are these parents right now?
Yeah, yeah, I've talked to a number of parents who have, like you said, either enrolled their kids in charter schools, moved cities or states, or decided to homeschool their kids because they just didn't feel like their kids were, getting an education, the education that they deserved at school. Or in some cases, they even felt like, if their child was being restrained or secluded in school, or not given the support they felt like their child needed, they were worried that they wouldn't even be safe at school. So in some cases, parents say they have, gone through all these steps that we outlined. They have maybe filed a complaint, they've talked to the district, they've tried to get the help they need, and they still feel like their kid just isn't, getting the help that they feel like they should get.
Mhm.
And even in some cases, parents have gone through what's called a due process hearing, which is, kind of the next step in this complaint process. And that is parents usually have to hire attorneys and it costs a lot of money and it, takes a lot of time. But even then, parents still feel like they're just not getting a win. And I think they're, really frustrated and a lot of times just kind of at a loss over what to do to get their child an education.
So, Becca, you did mention one bill that the legislature tried to get through, but it did not happen. Are there other things that the legislature is doing to try to address this issue?
Yeah, so we've seen, over the past few years, there's been, our superintendent Critchfield has talked about this issue more. There's been some increased awareness around special education and this, growing funding gap. But none of the bills that we've seen proposed have, advanced in the legislature. Um, so just recently we saw, Superintendent Critchfield in her budget requested $50 million to try to start to address this, and to allocate money based on the number of students in special education and that need. So we'll see where that goes next session, but we know in recent years, there have been efforts to change the funding formula that we have to allocate, discretionary money based on the number of students in special education, among other things. But we just really haven't seen any momentum with those bills getting through the
Mhm.
legislature.
Becca, do we know how many students are actually considered special education and would fall under the mandated uh, education that they are supposed to get from these are federal mandates, by the way.
Yeah, so we know about 12% of students in Idaho qualify for special education. So I think it's kind of around 35 to 40,000 students.
Mm.
Um, and that 12% number is actually one of the lowest percentages in the country. We've seen in other areas. It could be upwards of, 15, 18%.
So, is it true, Becca, that the state has received so many complaints about this that they actually had to hire another specialist just to investigate all of these complaints?
So we saw that the legislator approved a staff member to, in part, to help handle these complaints, and that staff member is kind of supporting the dispute resolution coordinator. So a few things do fall under that dispute resolution process. And the complaints and the due process hearings, like I mentioned, are, two of the big ones. And we've also seen in recent years an increase in families using what's called facilitation and mediation. So that's basically bringing in, what's supposed to be kind of a neutral party in some of these IEP meetings to help the family and the school district work together or to potentially resolve some disagreements.
Mhm. Do you know how many complaints they received in the last school year?
Yeah, so in the last school year, the department received 53 complaints, same number as the previous year. Um, and we've seen that, increasingly parents are resorting to this process, and that in most cases, a state investigator will find that at least one allegation in the complaint is founded. So, a majority of the complaints are investigated and have these associated findings of noncompliance and then the corrective action plans.
So, the superintendent rather in Boundary County School District said that special education in Idaho is, and I'm quoting, an unfundable mandate, unquote. Does your research back that up?
Yes, so this idea of special education being an unfunded or underfunded issue has long been an issue, or has long been, kind of something that administrators have been seeing. And this is on, a federal national scale. So we've seen on the national level, school districts across the country have struggled to find the funding to provide services. This was written into federal law, but some school districts and administrators feel that it was never fully funded to the extent that federal legislators have said it would be. And we've seen on a local level, of course, that most school districts in Idaho are spending far more than what they receive specifically for special education to, educate special education students and to provide these services. The superintendent in Boundary County has talked about running a supplemental levy to be able to provide some of the other programs that the district needs.
And Becca, is there anything that could be done to potentially fix this?
Yeah, I think, as state and local officials know, this is a really complex issue. But we've seen in recent months and recent years, that there's been more of an emphasis on looking at special education and trying to figure out what to do to, fix this problem to help school districts and to help these families that are just feeling really frustrated. And we know that, every student is different. They require different levels of services and different kinds of services. Um, so I think it kind of, remains to be seen what the legislature will do in response to, some of these issues that have been raised. Like I said, we've seen, Superintendent Critchfield has proposed this $50 million um, addition to the budget to help start to close that gap in the special education needs. But of course, this has been a challenge in Idaho and nationally for decades. So it will kind of remain to be seen what happens with that in this legislative session.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and diving into this issue with us. We've been speaking with reporter Becca Savransky. She covers education and equity issues for the Idaho Statesman. We've been discussing her report in ProPublica. It's titled Idaho Schools Consistently Break Disability Laws. Parents say they're not doing enough to fix the problem. We will, of course, put a link to that story on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.